The other huge piece here is the teacher in space, as you mentioned, Christa Mcauliffe, who is remembered when we talk about this, that's the name that pops up, often to the detriment of remembering the other crew members. Just from your perspective, that entire program, putting a teacher in space, it was kind of genius as far as putting eyes on the space program, but then it turns into a nightmare, right? Like, because of how it turns out, we think that was so dumb to do that. But at the time, I was very young, but I remember, I was probably only 4 or 5. I remember this. I remember that this got eyes on NASA when they said, we're putting, quote unquote, a normal person into space that isn't a politician who forced their way onto the space shuttle.
Right.
When you look back at this, is that what you saw, that this was on paper was a genius idea, but that it was a huge risk at the same time and they didn't realize it?
Well, I mean, this goes back to that dichotomy we were talking about earlier, which is that NASA was sort of misrepresenting to the public how dangerous what they were doing was. And there's a specific point in the space shuttle program at which this happens, which is that they have 4 test flights at the beginning of the program. They launch 4 times. And then once those 4 flights have been accomplished safely, they announce that the space shuttle program is operational. Now, this is a term that's usually used for, like, airliners, for example, when they've taken hundreds of test flights, then they'll declare, the Boeing 737 MAX operational, and then it can just fly as many times as you like without any further testing. So this was misleading because nobody who worked as an engineer at NASA or an astronaut believed for a second that the space shuttle was operational in the same way as an airliner would be after it had made 4 test flights. This goes more to the sort of the public relations aspect of NASA's approach, which was that they were deliberately trying to sell the public on the idea that spaceflight had become a routine enterprise. And so once they had accomplished this goal of convincing people that spaceflight was routine and the space shuttle was a lot like an airline, then it was a logical next step to say, well, now we do this, we do it in a shirt sleeve environment. You don't really need any special training. Once we've instructed you in how to use the toilet and how to get in and out of the emergency exit, then that's pretty much it. You don't need any special training to be a passenger on an airliner, and this is just going to be like that. And that's the approach they took with the spaceflight participant program. Because remember that Christa Mcauliffe, the teacher in space, was going to be the first of the spaceflight participants. But then within the year of that flight on Challenger, had it been successful, they were going to fly a journalist. And then next up was going to be an artist. And then there was going to be, poets or policemen or midwives or whoever they nominated to go forward and be a kind of civilian eye on spaceflight. So it started with a teacher in space, but they intended to expand this very rapidly to encompass lots of different people. But the reality was, yes, it was a very dangerous undertaking. And Christa Mcauliffe and her backup, Barbara Morgan, who was a teacher from Idaho, they knew how dangerous it was. Because I spoke to Barbara and I asked her this question, and she was very clear about the fact that Dick Scobie, the commander of the flight, had told them repeatedly that it was very risky. And one of the sort of most telling things he said to them was that this is very complicated. There's millions of things that can go wrong, but the one that's most likely to lead us astray is the human element, which ultimately proved to be the case.